Today, we're taking a deeper look at ministry in crisis. This is the second conversation we've had in this series, and we're focusing on caring for self and others during this particularly difficult period of time. We hope to journey with you as we find our way through the morass of conversations changing. We hope to journey with you as we find our way through the morass of changing circumstances, expectations, and experiences. These conversations are designed to give a broader context to what is going on in both in our own hearts and heads and in the world around us. It is our hope that this will inspire new thoughts, challenge presuppositions, and offer helpful tools, growth opportunities, and relationships to help you grow and flourish as you continue your faithful work for Jesus. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave a comment on our YouTube video, our Facebook page, or please send an email. There are various contacts on our website, Care4Clergy.com. Joining us today are our panel, and I will invite them to share with you who they are. Who wishes to go first? Ruth?
Okay, thank you. I'm Ruth Layzell. I live and work in England in the East Midlands. I work as an independent practitioner, as a counsellor, and as a supervisor, focusing largely on supervision of clergy. I also run a training in pastoral supervision here in Nottingham. I'm director of a psychotherapy training institute, and I've had some involvement in theological education in my past. I am a laywoman, currently worshipping in an Anglican church, though with a Baptist background, and I have a clergy spouse.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Dwight.
I'm Dwight Sweezy. Formerly, after retiring a few years ago, 32 years, I was the Director of Pastoral Services and Clinical Supervision at a large psychiatric hospital in Trenton, New Jersey. There, I developed a training program for interns and then residents in the CPE program through the College of Pastoral Supervision and Psychotherapy. During that time, I also developed for 20 years, a clergy support group that was a 2-hour-a-week group for clergy who wished to come together from different denominations for not only support, but accountability and self-care. So those are my major career. I'm a Methodist minister. I'm married to a Methodist minister, now retired, and I'm traveling full-time in my RV in the States, but not going very far right now. We're in Corpus Christi, Texas, in a Naval Air Force base, or naval base, where they train Navy pilots. And we're here in a small community, isolated for quite some time. Nice to be with you.
Thank you very much. And Peter.
I'm Peter Gubi. I'm full-time professor at the University of Chester in counseling and spiritual accompaniment. I'm also a Moravian minister, colleague of Jared's, and I serve a congregation in Manchester in a little town called Duckingfield. I also have a practice as a counsellor, pastoral supervisor, and clinical supervisor.
Thank you very much, Peter. And the last video that we did, I forgot to introduce myself, and I almost did it again. So I'm Jared Stevens. I'm the minister, the Moravian minister at Cliftonville Moravian Church and at Ballinderry Moravian Church. I'm also a member of the Care4Clergy team. So welcome one and all, and thank you very much for sharing in this time with us. To kind of set the stage for our conversation, I think I'd like to turn to the question, doing spiritual direction is getting in tune with God. How do you see the role of therapy for Christian ministers, especially as we address what that looks like? What do you think?
Who would you like to go first, Jared?
Anyone jump in if you have a thought, come in, and we'll be respectful of one another.
I think my first thing is that there is no difference between being a priest and being a human being. So there's something about recognizing our humanness and our humanity within that. There's also something for me about vulnerability being at the center of the gospel. If we kind of particularly think of Christ on the cross, you don't get any more vulnerable than that. And there are passages in the Bible that we can find where Jesus took his disciples to one side to give them some space to rest and to debrief, if you like, in their ministry. So there's something for me about having a space to do all of that. Within our humanity, we all have struggles. We can still be people of great faith. And in fact, if you look through Christian history, there are times where people experience the dark night of the soul. So struggle is a very human phenomena and a very spiritual phenomena, really. And I guess it's how we grow through our struggles, and therapy and therapists can help us with that growth and that journey. So I don't see it as a sign of weakness or a sign of lack of faith. I see it as acknowledging our humanity and reaching out for help and support at those times.
Please, Ruth.
I think I would want to add to that there are two aspects I think that are relevant here. One is that we are all human beings with human beings around us, bringing us up, interacting with us. And one of the things I guess we know is that all human beings have our limitations and our flaws. And there may be some things about why do those of us who go into helping professions, whether that be ministry or counselling or other helping professions. And it's my experience that often there's something in ourselves that we are working out in the process of that. I don't think that is at odds with a sense of vocation at all. I think it's one of those things that God uses to enable and facilitate our ministries. But if there is that kind of vulnerability within us that we are working with as we are in our helping professions or our ministries, then we need to be alert to how that may impact on us as we minister, but also how that may impact on others. So there's something about becoming aware of ourselves, and that may need some intentional work at times. The other thing is that ministry and any of the helping professions has its cost to us as human beings and as individuals. And there are times when we will need to come back for some repair. And I think at those times, the support of somebody who is outside the ministry situation and can help us to review what has happened and how that's impacted us can be really helpful. That might be therapy, or it might be that kind of reflection ministry that pastoral supervision offers. But I think there's something about there's a maintenance issue about how do we maintain in ministry? How do people maintain in ministry? And that may need a specific dedicated time and place to be able to work those things through.
I think that the idea of self-care is where I start. And self-care includes addressing the possibility there's compassion burnout when we're in an environment where we're giving to others. I think the idea of therapy is overwhelming to some folks because they think they're going to be in front of someone who can see through them, see and even know them better than they know themselves. But in fact, the process is really having someone mirror back what they hear and what they and a perspective that you may not have thought of. I've always found that if 2 or 3 people gather and start sharing themselves, then in the midst of that, a therapeutic experience develops and grows. And there's a sense of vulnerability, but there's also a sense of intimacy that someone else is either experiencing similar things or able to hear my frustrations, pain, joys, and accept them so that I can accept them as well.
And if we don't have access to somebody who, a therapist, for example, or somebody who's trained in, because a lot of churches won't pay for professional help, and some of them that do, I have a friend who's a minister in Germany, and she was wanting to have therapy, but she was concerned that if the higher ups in her denomination found out that she needed to have help, that there might be some kind of negative stigma attached to that. So for a variety of reasons, people may be hesitant to go the professional route. What are some ways that we can start finding these relationships, or finding a way that we can safely deal with these burdens?
A lot of denominations have continuing education for their clergy. When I was running my clergy group, there were those who used some of their continuing education funds for the weekly sessions, which were not extreme burden on them. The 2-hour session was pretty affordable, but this was part of what they planned every year as continuing education, because it is education in the context of others of the same or similar vocation. And you not only learn, you have input into other people's ministry, and it's a collaborative approach. That was one way to address the financial situation.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's about having a culture change within the church. I think for many years there's been a kind of suspicion of the sort of psychologization of theology in a way, and almost a fear of embracing other truths that can add to a greater truth, in a sense. And so I think if you kind of start in theological colleges, as Dwight has said, with that kind of reflective practice, whether it's in groups or in a form of pedagogy that's used to teach theology, starting from self and applying biblical narratives, if you like, to personal journeys and things like that, then it begins to open out a culture where people see the benefit of that. You know, I suppose it kind of mirrors a little bit of what's happened generally in society, where it has been seen as a weakness to talk about struggles and so on. That's a shift that's generally happening in society, with footballers and sport and other sectors of society, employers and so on. I think we have to be a little bit careful, though, that we don't go too much the other way, where, you know, sometimes I'm not quite sure what mental health means anymore. You know, so if somebody comes into school feeling anxious because they've forgotten to put on their fake tan and they're frightened of being teased by their colleagues and stuff like that, and think that they've got anxiety and depression and therefore need to see a counselor, I think maybe we've gone too much the other way. So it's just finding that balance of how do you grow in resilience and respect that, but also reach out when there is a need to, and yeah, look at how we grow from our pain, in a sense.
I think one of the other important resources is having reflective practice groups in the kind of way that Peter's been suggesting, and I think when people come together, particularly when it's well facilitated, either because there are people within the group who are able to do that, or because there's somebody there to facilitate the group, that reflection on practice becomes a conversation at depth, where the real concerns of the minister can be spoken. I think sometimes in clergy groups there can be a kind of unwillingness to admit any vulnerability or weakness or failure. And in my experience, when groups like that have been well facilitated, those things begin, as the trust develops, that begin to emerge, and there is a real sense of the support and collegiality of the group rather than a competition between people. And as a practicing counsellor, seeing a number of clergy over a number of years, one of the things I've often felt is this person would not be here in a therapeutic space had they had that opportunity for reflective practice or pastoral supervision, that if they'd been able to attend to this as they've gone through ministry, they wouldn't need to be in this space now. It's a work-related issue rather than a personal problem, as it were.
Yeah.
Is this what you meant by maintenance earlier? Is that you mentioned?
Yes. I mean, it is one of the things. I worked for a number of years as a social worker, and then subsequently I've been in counselling and psychotherapy practice. One of the staple requirements of both of those professions is regular supervision, by which we mean an opportunity, a space to reflect on practice, to recognise how that's impacting me, but also to reflect on how's it going, what am I doing, how could I do it more effectively, what am I missing in the work that I'm doing. And having that kind of space, I think, develops practice. It means you're accountable to somebody else. It means you're supported. You're not on your own in the situation. I think that's a real issue for a number of clergy and ministers, is that they are very much in a situation on their own, feel isolated. And to be able to come together with other people who have a similar experience, but in a collaborative way rather than in a competitive way, I think can be a huge support to ongoing maintenance, ongoing ability to function within the role.
Dwight, this might be a good time to discuss your clergy group that you ran for 20 years, because I think that parallels well with what you're saying, Ruth.
Yeah, I wanted to underscore that too. I don't think that groups that simply get together and then someone has a louder voice and they start leading it are very helpful. I was the outsider, but I've used a model I learned during a DMin that I did, which included going to Christ Church in Oxford. I learned about Robin Skinner from England, who was he and Priscilla taught a family therapist, and his was more of a collaborative facilitative leader approach. It's an open systems approach. And I used that approach with other clergy. I was a player coach, so to speak, because I had the same or similar experiences in ministry. And the requirement in the group was in rotation every week. It doesn't have to be weekly, but this was weekly. One person was scheduled to bring in a presentation about something that was affecting them. It can be family of origin, it can be parish issues, it can be family issues, things that are affecting them in their ministry. And they presented that in writing, so there was some accountability. Got feedback, and the second hour was for people in the group to go around and check in and keep us in touch with where they are with crisis in their lives, experiences, celebration. And the 2 hours was really filled, and people came with an expectation that they were going to not only share but be heard, and everything was confidential, so that they could feel the freedom over time as they grew to trust the group, that this was a place that was kind, but was going to hold them accountable when we saw, in some cases, a pattern that was not going to be healthy for the individual, and give them feedback on that. So that's the structure of it. It was an evolution that I came up with that was kind of like for those that have been IPR groups and CP training, that type of thing, but it moved on to a little bit more of accountability and support. And I then did workshops and taught that system or that idea to others. So that's what I worked with. And there were those who stayed with it, who felt that their ministry was saved because of it, because of that opportunity. I've seen the model work on every other week, but I do think you need to engage somebody to be the facilitator of it. I do think someone who's close enough to understand that clergy are soloists many times. They don't have much of a support system. If you look at the studies As clergy, we generally don't have personal friends outside the parish. We often don't even have hobbies or interests. So self-care includes a lot of things that aren't happening for us, and we have to be a generalist. And few of us went to seminary to be a generalist. We felt that we called to one thing or another, preaching, Bible, whatever. And we thought that's what we were going to do. And then we ended up doing budgets, building programs, things that we had no idea or cared about because we thought someone else was going to take care of that. So those are unique experiences. There is no other profession that I know of that is as intimate as ministry, that calls upon the minister and sometimes their family more than any other profession I can think of. It's a 24/7. And so having boundaries and knowing and learning from others sometimes how they work their boundaries to have a personal life is helpful and healthy.
Yeah. So having a safe place
Yes.
where you know that you will be heard, that you will not be mocked,
Yep.
that your troubles will be taken seriously no matter how foolish they make you feel. But being able to have a safe place to express your deepest pain to people who understand you, and then sharing in that conversation with a facilitator who can be trusted to facilitate, to keep
And
things.
keep it on focus. We had a situation where we expected, when we invited someone to come into the group when there was an opening, the group was always filled with at least 6 people, but we would say that I would talk to them about the group and say, why don't you come for 3 sessions? And then we'll openly talk about how you feel this is working for you or not working for you. And the group will also give feedback as to the sense of whether this is a place that they are going to continue to grow with you and you grow with them, so that there wasn't the threat of you sign a contract and you had to be there, that type of approach to it. It was, how are you feeling about the experiences? Usually by the 3rd session, people have an idea if this is for them or not. Very few folks walked away. The average was 4 to 6 years of commitment.
Wow.
And sometimes it's because they got a call in Texas and they couldn't commute to New Jersey or something like that. So.
Yeah. Peter, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, embarrassingly, this is where I've done quite a lot of research, really, and I don't know if it's right or not, but I've got a book coming out.
Fantastic.
Called Reflective Practice Groups for Clergy. And, I share exactly what Dwight and Ruth have said. I'm a great advocate of this. I echo what Ruth has said about if you're wanting to, save having to have personal therapy or whatever, a lot of the issues that arise in ministry could be facilitated and held in such a group. And it should be, in my opinion, it should be part of the culture of clergy support that all denominations offer to their clergy.
Yeah.
How do you think we can get from the denominations in Northern Ireland have some have facility for this and some do not, and some take advantage of it and some do not. We have a lot of non-denominational ministers as well that are really out there on their own. It is quite difficult to form these kind of relationships on your own. Would it be helpful, do you think, since we have such a cross section, would it be helpful for us to begin to think about forming an interdenominational group where we have facilitators set up to, I mean, this is a programmatic question rather than a personal, but do you think something like that would work, or must it come out of the denomination itself?
No, I mean, I think there's a culturing amongst clergy, and I'm a clergy person myself, so I think I'm entitled to say this, where almost we expect the denomination or the church to provide everything. And another part of me is also counselor, psychotherapist, where there's a mandatory requirement that we are in supervision and we pay for that ourselves. So our employer, if we're lucky enough to have that, might pay for it. But generally, counselors, psychotherapists will pay for their own supervision to remain accredited or registered or whatever. And so for me, I don't see why a group of clergy couldn't get together and pay a $5 each for an external facilitator and make it work for themselves.
Mhm.
But there is this kind of thing about looking to Mother Church to provide and to pay for. And because funds are generally short and priorities are given to other things financially, this comes low down on the list, as it were. But I would like to empower ministers from whatever denomination to get together and make this work for themselves out of their own interest, really. They would benefit from it. And, you would probably pay a gym subscription if you join a gym to look after your physical health. So why not your spiritual and mental health by joining something like this and paying a bit towards it?
Yeah, fair enough.
I think it's a really good idea, Jared. That the idea, I think the impetus has got to come from somewhere. So I think it's quite hard for individual ministers to find who else can they join up with in order to find such a group. So if there is an initiative that you can stimulate, I think that sounds brilliant. I just want to say something about our experience of running a pastoral supervision training course. What's happening in the people who apply for this is that they begin to see that there's a need for such support for clergy. It's not usually that their denomination has supported them to come and apply for the training. They've done it off their own bat. Some of them are clergy, some of them are lay people, counselors, who understand the value of this kind of support to interpersonal work. And they come as a mixed group. So we have a mixed group of different denominations, different professions as well. And there's a real richness about the integration of those different perspectives. And our experience is that therapists learn from clergy learn from therapists, and the different denominations learn from each other. Quite helpful to have an outside perspective within the group, so that the kind of the blind spots, if you like, of one perspective can be met or challenged by the perspectives of another context.
Yeah, I too support the cross-denominational approach to it. There's less competition with clergy. If it's one denomination, frankly, we're in the Methodist system, we're competing against each other sometimes, in Presbyterian systems as well, if it's a local. So, and not only learning from each other, there is also, I think, a safety that helps the confidentiality.
Yeah.
Because if it's an all Methodist group, who's to say that someone's going to talk to the superintendent or the bishop about it, things like that. Also, there are fewer assumptions. You may come with an assumption from your denomination, but it's not necessarily supported by everybody in a group who's from different perspectives. And that helps an awful lot to expand one's experience and to begin to look at the assumptions that we're carrying in ministry.
Absolutely.
The research that I've done in this is within the Church of England, and the research shows that it works best when there isn't a dual role, in a sense. So people come from different deaneries or chapters rather than come from the same chapter or deanery. So even if it's not cross-denominational, careful thought has to be given to the dynamics within the group so that trust can build and that competition can be diminished as much as possible. I mean, within our own denomination, the Moravian Church, that Jared and I share, we actually have a history going back to the 1700s of things called Bandon, where groups of people came together and talked about what was on their heart, as they were, shared what was on their heart. So we have this in our history. But I think, would it work amongst the Moravian clergy? I don't know. I'd love to think that it did, because I think it would give a real rich texture to us. But the politics within the church probably would be always present in the room, I suppose. Yeah.
I think these are the failings and foibles of human nature. But that brings me on to the next stage of this conversation: is what then are the stumbling blocks for ministers? Because we've alluded to them quite a bit. I think it'd be nice to flush out some of the. There is a stigma against airing your dirty laundry or even admitting there's a problem. So can we talk more about the stumbling blocks to this kind of cooperative quest for mental health?
I guess there's something about the expectation or myth that ministers have to be competent, always in charge, always the helper, and that makes it very difficult to recognize vulnerability and to recognize the value of vulnerability as well, of not knowing, of being prepared to be open, of understanding that our humanity is part of what we bring to ministry, and that sometimes our humanity helps our humility, which means that we can more easily come alongside people rather than be over above or rescuing or whatever else we may get into. So I think the myth of omnicompetence, and I think the model of ministry, which is the minister or the vicar or the pastor who is the one in charge, doesn't help that, because it puts a huge burden or a huge pile of expectation on the shoulders of one human being. And I mean, it just seems to me, biblically, it was never supposed to be like that. That, you know, Jesus sends them out in twos at least. Jesus surrounds himself with a band of 12 people and more if you count the women. And you know, there was all. It seems to me that there was always meant to be community and collaboration. And yes, obviously we need structures and we need leadership, but that kind of omnicompetent individual minister, I think, is a myth or an expectation, a model which needs some amendment or adjustment. And I know that's hard because many denominations are set up that way, but it doesn't have.
I see that playing out oftentimes when I was working with seminarians who always had to have an answer to every question asked them. And so in supervising their clinical work in a psychiatric hospital, where the questions that were asked would often throw them, they began to see that maybe not having the answer, but learning how to listen to the question and what was behind it, moved them away from this authoritarian viewpoint of clergy. And at least I think it created some thinking for them anyway. So that's one reason I enjoyed so much supervising folks in my comfort zone, which was the psych hospital. So I think it's getting away from having to have an answer to every question and learning to listen to what's behind it. Let's go with some of the trappings.
I think too, some of the kind of barriers, which I think was your original question, are around sort of personal issues, around shame, fear of failure, lack of confidence, that kind of thing. And sometimes it's easier to put on a mask and try and be something that you're fundamentally not, than to acknowledge who you fundamentally are, warts and all, I suppose. And it's trusting that will be accepted and acceptable. You know, it's suppose if our theology is the unconditional love of Christ, then how do we manifest that with each other? How do we offer each other unconditional love and acceptance and tolerance and so on? But if we don't manifest that, if we're kind of more Pauline theology, I suppose, as our model, then maybe, you know, we hide our flaws.
Ruth, I think you were going to have a comment, or?
Yes, I was, and I can't remember now what it was at all.
Sorry.
This issue about what you said, Peter, I think is absolutely true. The masks that we hide behind. What's the psalm? I have searched you and known you. There's this, Calvin commented on that by saying that there's this David, when he spoke these words, was so brave. And there's this sense that he invited God's scrutiny so that he may learn and that he may rest in God's care. That psalm it's a beautiful example. And the reason I know this, we studied it last night in Bible study. So, this is part of the Christian experience, and it should be part of the Christian experience. And yet we hesitate. We don't just hesitate. We throw our head up, and we try to keep as far away from an environment where our weakness, especially as clergy, I'm talking as a clergy member, and I understand this intimately. There are issues of privacy. I think we're all trained as ministers to hold our cards as close to our chest as possible, because we always have those gossips and the people who are trying to pry information out of us for no good reason other than they want to talk about the pastor. So privacy is a big issue. Respectability. And even though we might not want to be authoritarian, we also feel there's a certain sense that we have to have weight behind our words. So if we show our weakness, will that undermine our faith in the gospel? Will it undermine our competence as interpreter of the word of God? And also the other big issue that I have seen personally is this competition within churches, within denominations. There is this sense of competition, and it's a dangerous thing, and yet it is present.
Something that you've said there, Jared, that made me, it stimulated a thought of mine, which is that anybody in leadership is in a difficult position. It was your comment about privacy, that there is an appropriateness about not bleeding all over people. That thing that there's an appropriate sort of containment of our own stuff in order to support, encourage, and contain things for other people. I think leaders do have that role. On the other hand, there have to be spaces then for people in leadership to be able to acknowledge the other side of themselves, which is the impact of holding those spaces, holding those roles, and also of the personal stuff that they're not at liberty because of the role to share. So again, for me, that's a reason for having these spaces, where safe spaces, where some of these things that can't be publicly acknowledged maybe, or spoken about, can be spoken about, so that we can experience ourselves as whole people rather than as masks that must stay in place the whole time, so that almost the mask becomes who we are.
I think that just might also add to what you're saying, because I've discovered over the years that an awful lot of clergy find themselves drawn to ministry thinking that the congregation will make them feel good and feel wanted, accepted, celebrated. And they're putting too much expectation on the people they serve to meet their personal needs. And so what happens is there's a number of things that occur, we know, with clergy that bleed out into the public in negative ways. So a group of that is supportive, working with you, will help you see some of those things that you took for granted, where you let your boundaries down, where you allowed too much of yourself to be a burden to the people that you serve, rather than looking at it as to why that's part of your psyche of who you are and how you can get the next another place. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
I think for me it's a question of balance. Too much of either, whether it's bleeding over others or withholding self, is unhealthy. And it's about finding the wisdom to discern what's, so sharing of self can be very permission giving, for example. It can bring the gospel alive through sharing examples from your own experiencing and so on. So it's about holding that. I mean, I like the kind of theology of our, the Moravian denomination, where, the minister is just another brother or sister, so that idea, brother, sister, let me serve you, let me be as Christ to you, let me have the grace to let you be my servant too, sort of thing. So there's a give and take. There isn't an authority model of ministry, but that we have collaborative responsibility as a congregation, as a church committee, etc. I have no more vote than anybody else, so that there is an equality within that, which I really like and respect, but recognize it's not there in other denominations.
Well, you bring that up, and coming from the Presbyterian background, where we are a democratic system of government, but whereas a lot of the times the minister is still set apart in the Presbyterian tradition. And I came to realize when I came to the Moravian Church that I quite liked that set apartness. There's an advantage to it. You walk, oh, there's the minister. Oh, whereas you don't get that at all in the Moravian Church. It's fantastic. I've come to really, really appreciate this demythologizing of the minister. Now, it's not completely gone, by the way, but there is an effort towards that an active process that is an attempt to keep this balance between leadership and equality before Christ. And it's a very humbling church, the Moravian Church. I say that because that has been a huge blessing to myself, as I am humbled as I enter into ministry and I work with other people. My ego doesn't get in the way as much as it used to. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's this collaborative, again, we keep coming back to this concept, the collaboration of brothers and sisters in a faithful journey together in Christ. And finding these relationships where we can find trust, having this intentional space with somebody who has had some training in keeping a good balance and keeping safety protocols in place and keeping people's conversations sacred. A facilitator that can be trusted to facilitate. These are all really important things in our emotional life, in our mental life, in our spiritual life. If I may have, I had an experience this year that I found quite remarkable. I'm a very private person. I fall prey to all of the common sins of humanity and of leadership, and I don't tend to like trusting other people. So I participated in a leadership training program this year, and one of the things I was quite hesitant about and unsure about was a gathering for 2 days with a bunch of strange clergy people in a hotel in the middle of nowhere. And I'm like, oh dear, what's going to happen? And what are we going to do? They're going to make me share, aren't they? They're going to make me talk. And I was quite hesitant about this, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. Was I going to share? Was I going to keep private? And these are people who are strangers to me. And then the first person in our group was so completely vulnerable. It made me cry. Tears of love, tears of joy. Like I couldn't stop. Like there's this sense that this person so desperately needed to share the burdens of their life that they opened themselves up to us, a room of strangers. And from that moment on, we weren't strangers anymore. And no one held back. And there was a cleansing, a healing that happened in that group that I have never seen in that kind of environment before. It was quite profound. When we trust, and when we feel we can trust, and when we are vulnerable, God works.
Courageous.
Absolutely. That the first person who went was the most courageous person I've ever seen in my life. I certainly wouldn't have had the courage to say what he did. So I bear testimony to the fact that this sort of environment can be incredibly helpful for clergy members who are seeking strength for their journey and nourishment for their souls, especially in the midst of this the current crisis. And I think this is a good time to kind of move into the second stage of this conversation. Anxiety today. Why is there a heightened sense of anxiety over this new environment?
Can I jump in here?
Please. Yes.
I recently accessed a video by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a trauma specialist in the States. And one of the things that he was saying, and this is echoed in all sorts of places, I think, is that what we're facing at the moment is a threat. We're facing a threat which is not visible. It's not easily identified or tracked. So we don't, where's it coming from? So this virus that's around, who's got it? Who might infect me? Who might I infect? Have I got it? We don't, there's so much that we don't know about even what the threat is. And then so much that we don't know about it and how it will affect us. And then when we are faced with threat, the normal responses are to mobilize, to fight, or to flee. And here we are in a situation where we have a threat, and the thing we're being asked to do is to stay at home. So to stop, to be immobile. And that means that there's all the kind of resources that we normally use to address a threat are kind of swirling around in us. There's kind of more adrenaline than we know what to do with or can do anything with. There is no room for the heroic action, which is the normal first response to trauma or threat. And so here we are feeling vulnerable and helpless. And it's likely that's going to, kind of mobilize the whole kind of nervous system in a way that we can't readily deal with. So anxiety is going to go up, and it's going to be generalized because we don't know where the threat is coming from. So why are we more anxious? Well, because there's a threat, because we can't do anything much well, some of us can. Some people who are health workers are able to mobilize, but then there's a different kind of anxiety because they're also very much exposed to the threat. So the anxiety is different. And then we're also cut off from those resources for a number of people, which are normally safety making. So our attachment systems, where we connect closely with those people who make us feel safe, we are at the moment when we're physically not able to be in the same space often as parents, children, those people that we would want to gather around us in a time of threat. Or our congregations, so we are kind of fragmented just by the very nature of the situation that we're dealing with and the advice we are given to manage that threat. It's totally counterintuitive to what we're wired to do. Sorry, that'll be enough from me now.
Very good. I would say that my experience is that wearing a mask when I do go out and being unsure how healthy someone else is creates a tremendous amount of suspiciousness that I've not experienced. I can't read a face. I can't smile and look like I might not be a threatening person. I mean, I can do that, but nobody can see that behind the mask. And it does create such barriers that even with strangers, it's disconcerting and adds to all that Ruth is saying. Tremendous anxiety there. The only thing that's helping a little bit, as I deal with my own anxiety, living in an area where I'm not near anyone except my wife that I know, is to try to be as physical during the day. We have a wonderful area we can walk or ride bikes, so that's fortunate for us. Not everybody can do that. But doing something to get that adrenaline or that anxiety, put it into some kind of activity, has been somewhat of a help. And the other thing that adds to the anxiety is that you don't know where the end is going to be or when the end is going to be, what that's going to look like. And the new language of the new reality, new way of being, the new way of operating, doesn't give us a handle on what that new way looks like. So there's such uncertainty, whether it's in a congregational situation or personal life situation. It continues to add to the fuel where if we thought 2 weeks was enough, we probably could handle that. But now we're looking into weeks and months, and who knows? As I talk about it, I realize you need to get more anxious about it. So that unknown is very hard for most human beings.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's lots of truth in what Dwight and Ruth have shared. I can see the resonances. I guess for me, there are as many causes of anxiety as there are individuals. So I think I would want to start off by trying to root out in pastoral supervision or in counseling what that person's anxiety is about for them, really. For me, when I have been anxious about it, has been more around, my house isn't in order, in a sense. I haven't made a will, or I have made a will, but it's to my father, who I live with, who's 90 years old. If I go before him, then at least he's got a house to live in. If he goes before me, then what do I do with my estate? And those kind of rather stupid questions in a way, but they're important questions nonetheless. So I haven't particularly felt like fleeing or fighting or whatever. Just a sense of unfinished business and no way of finishing that unfinished business, in a sense. The solicitors aren't open and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just making a to-do list of things to do when things get back to some sense of normality, really. Yeah. So yeah, for me, it depends on what we bring to this, what our background is around trauma. How do we deal with uncertainty? This thing about trusting God's will. How are we with submission to God's will or not? Do we need to be in control? All those kind of issues heighten anxiety, I think.
And I think one of the other elements in it is that experiencing one traumatic situation is likely to trigger previous trauma. So it may well be raising for people things that may be resolved in some way, but are nonetheless they're there to be touched. And so and that will be a very individual thing. And I guess for some people, this whole and certainly I've heard people say this over the last couple of days, that for some people there's a relief about being isolated from, actually we don't have to deal with some of the people that we find difficult to deal with, or actually for people who are overwhelmed by people impact, actually to have a bit of respite is quite pleasant. So we're very individual, I think, in the ways that we respond to this situation.
And I think that brings up problems for ministers, especially whichever side you land on that. I know ministers who are just jumping with joy right now because they've been sick and tired of their church for decades. They finally get a bit of a break. But that brings up questions of anxiety about, am I actually supposed to, where's my faith? What's wrong with me? On the other hand, I know that a lot of ministers are not coping well with this time because their entire lives are their congregation, and they get their support structure from their congregation. They get validation for their existence from their congregation. And then trying to find for both of those sides, what is my duty in the midst of this? And where's my response supposed to be? And I think there seems to be a lot of anxiety in that, figuring that out. And I think especially now that we're looking at the end of the stage 1 and moving into stage 2, there's a lot of anxiety that's come up about, well, what does this new stage look like? So we've kind of gotten used to this, but there's this other move that we're very uncertain about.
Well, it does call on our creativity, and it calls on us to maybe move into electronic communication like this more than we had wanted to, and we might have even resisted it in the past. But it puts us, we're very much like, I would say, late night comedians, Colbert and so forth, who are trying to keep the show going from their own living room. But there's no response. I mean, their jokes just don't go as far without some response. I'm sure preaching to a screen must have similar. You're waiting for to see the faces and to hear some kind of response, and it must seem very cold in a clinical, cold way. But it does call us to be more, to be creative, and maybe reach out to people within the congregation who have better skills than we do, or have thought of ways in which we could, in ministry, connect a little better than we thought. That could be a collaborative kind of approach to it. I did have one personal response to what Ruth said about trauma. I don't mean to move back too far, but I've noticed, I happen to be a Vietnam veteran, and I noticed that the daily body counts of the coronavirus death has connected again to my trauma of those terrible body counts from Vietnam back in the 60s when I came back home and went to college in the 70s. And so that's an understanding of my own trauma there and that connection. But I can imagine that any of us with trauma in our past are going to find ourselves in touch with that trauma, because this is a traumatic time. And even if somehow we come out this in some period of time, foreseeable future, we're going to need to deal with the fact that this is traumatic. It's traumatic to congregations. It's traumatic to the leaders of congregations as well. And not to address that fact that it's trauma, and trauma affects us in many different ways on an individual basis, would be poor leadership on our own parts.
And can I just follow that up? I'll do a parallel plug to Peter and say that I've contributed a chapter to a book called Tragedies in Congregations, in Christian Congregations, and that has a lot of really helpful wisdom for ministers. So I'd recommend that as a resource. You can Google it.
A very good chapter it is too.
I'll put a link to, from our last conversation, we talked about Henry Nouwen's Wounded Healer, and I put a link up for that resource, and we'll do the same for this one. Any other books? Because ministers, let's just face it, ministers, we all think that the answer to all of life's mysteries lie in a book. Yeah, we say the book, but we love books. And they are very helpful. We can get, this actually moves us well to the next.
Just before you do, Jared, sorry, can I just go back in terms of the anxiety issue, and just reflecting on a lot of ministers tend to be introverts. I mean, the research shows that the majority are introverts, and so social media and doing things like this are, I'm an introvert, so doing something like this is quite a challenge, and I was quite noticeable in myself as to how anxious I was before we started. I think that's calmed down a bit now. But it's putting yourself out there, not knowing who your audience is. There is that sense of exposure, and that can be a bit scary, really. So just wanting to acknowledge, that embracing these new skills is not so much about change as about not knowing who your audience is, or where this is going to go. It's not unlike writing a paper or a book or something and just putting it out there and it just goes where it goes, isn't it? It does what it does. Sorry, I just wanted to. No,
thank you very much for acknowledging that. And I would say I feel exactly the same sense of anxiety before. This is a recording. it is going out into the ether. I take a great deal of comfort in preaching on a Sunday, knowing that the words end. I know you people, you love me, and you let me get away with making mistakes. You know me as a human being, and I know you, and we can share in that moment. Whereas when you're preaching to a screen, yeah, no, thank you, Peter. That's, I think, wisdom to share. I think we need permission like that to feel what we're feeling, and acknowledging those feelings helps us move on, helps us grow, and helps us to be able to rest in the promise of God's love. Like if we just keep all of these fears inside and say, no, I shouldn't feel these things because I'm a Christian, that doesn't help us move on.
Yeah, I kind of want to remind people that the Psalms exist. And also one of the contributors to the book I mentioned makes the point that much of Scripture is written in the wake of trauma. Okay, we do have that one book that is precious to us, but it's often a response to trauma. It's a response to suffering. So let's not edit out those parts which really do grapple with the realities of our human existence, and the fact that the lament and complaint are part of the canon of Scripture.
Absolutely. We'll put a link up to the book. What was it called again?
Tragedies and Christian Congregations.
Tragedies and Christian Congregation. That sounds like a lovely resource. And also, if any of you have any more that you would recommend for our journey through this time, I think we're all looking for something to kind of get our heads around what's happening, and so I think a few resources would be a good starting point. What are some other things that you would see as practical, small steps in the right direction as we're continuing to find our way forward in this fairly isolated time? Can you offer some insights, suggestions for ministers, especially as we're wrestling with our strange and wonderful world?
Can I suggest some very practical self-care steps? My own supervisor asks me how I'm caring for myself in this time, and I've said there are several things that I've put in place, but also I was delighted to find that they are advised by Bessel van der Kolk, who's really is an expert in this area. So having, if we feel helpless, then having something which increases our sense of agency. So having rhythms, having routines, and clergy should be good at this in many ways, in terms of routines of morning and evening prayer. Now maybe this is a time when there's space for that in a way that there isn't often in the press of ministerial life. So having some routines, being creative as well. So doing the garden, focusing on cooking, getting the guitar out, or opening the piano, or dancing. I mean, so physical exercise is also important. I'm glad that amongst the restrictions, what we haven't been forbidden to do is to get out and exercise, to go for a walk. And also I heard a reflection of, which apparently came out of Wuhan, about focusing on this as a Sabbath, as an opportunity to understand what Sabbath is, a rest for the world, for nature around us, but also a rest for ourselves. And I know that doesn't feel like what it is when you're preparing to do things online and preparing all the material that you need. So that there can be a lot of busyness still, but actually taking time to listen to the bird song, or notice the iris that's just come out in the garden, to connect with those things in a way that maybe we don't take time to do when life is normal.
If reading is helpful for some individuals while they finally have the time to read, if this is a time to read, the book that's come to my mind today in this discussion is Robin Skinner's book, Institutes and how to survive them. It's helpful for a group of folks who want to gather together with the leader, but it's also individually helpful. It's been a long time since I've read it. Used to get it from Blackwell. I think it's Blackwell or Blackburn bookstores, but it's Robin with a Y. It's Institutes and How to Survive Them. I think this would be a good time. It's not a read that most people would do right now, maybe. It's a secular read, but it might be helpful. And I'm adding to what Ruth said, reading is something that I've enjoyed lately, that I've put away for a while, being active and doing other things, but this gives us time to sit and read if that's something we get pleasure out of, and takes us to a kind of a comfort zone for us.
Thank you.
I mean, for me, it's that word balance, which seems to be coming back time and time again in our conversation, for me anyway. All of those things are very important to develop. But there's something for me about also having a sense of other focusedness, as it were. So developing one's prayer life can be helpful. It doesn't mean sitting down and going through the motions of prayer. Prayer is an attitude to life, so a sensible walk with God, and bringing into mind other people. So it can be an opportunity really to think about people, to pick up the phone and talk to them. The congregation that I serve probably had more pastoral care from me over the last few weeks than I did before, because I can work from home. I have a better work-life balance. I can pick up the telephone more frequently and just see how they're doing, etc., rather than attending all these pointless meetings that life seems to be occupied with in a way. So yeah, for me, it's about having that balance of being me-focused, exercise, routine, all that kind of thing, but also other-focused, touching base with people.
Mm-hmm. So there are real positives that are coming out of this time, especially for spiritual beings, for Christians who, this is a unique opportunity to test our faith, to actually set aside the things of this world. I know my first reaction was a bizarre reaction for me, was concerns about money. Like, will the church end? What's my future like? And as soon as it was this, I did not recognize that as one of my areas of concern until this happened, and I realized that my focus had shifted somewhere along the way. And I must say, this has been a surprising time of growth for me, of anxiety, high anxiety, and then processing why and what. And with conversations like this with friends and colleagues has been incredibly helpful as I'm unpacking that kind of the trauma. Past traumas, very strangely enough, they've definitely popped up for me and others that I've talked to, not knowing what to do with myself on a Sunday. Until we established a routine, finding other ways to connect to God other than through our Sunday worship. So I'm finding richness in my spiritual life opening up. It's taken weeks to get to this point, but it's interesting to see how this time of anxiety and stress has actually benefited my spiritual journey. And so I think focusing on the problems, the difficulties, the struggles that we have is important, but also looking at there are serious benefits that God is working in this world in us and through us and with us that we have to remember, and proclaim a gospel of hope. We believe in Jesus Christ, the resurrected Lord, and this is a wonderful opportunity to explore what that looks like in our day-to-day lives.
I think I want to add something which perhaps just is a bit of a counterbalance to what you've just said, which I absolutely support, Jared. But I think one of the other things, the experience for me has been finding out how human I am. So my limitations, I found myself getting very impatient with people at times. I've found myself, I had something else in mind that I can't now bring to mind, but you know, my own foibles have surfaced, and my lack of patience has surfaced at times. So I think it's also been, you know, the other side of the resurrection experience of those puzzling times. Recently I've been reflecting on that time between the death and the resurrection appearances, when the disciples must have been in absolute confusion about what on earth was going on and what sense did it make, and various kind of, you know, personal stuff comes up for each of them. You know, Thomas is kind of, can't believe what other people are saying. Peter rushes off and does what Peter does, and Mary is distraught. So they do all the things that they characteristically would do. And then Jesus comes alongside two of them and helps them to understand their confusion. And it just feels, I suppose part of this experience for me has been about recognizing my humanity and my limitations in this situation. That's been quite humbling and salutary. It's and that's an interesting word, isn't it? Because it links to salvation. There's something that is wholesome about recognizing who we actually are, and letting that be part of who we are under God, in whatever it is that we're doing.
Again, going back to that, the masks and living behind the masks, and this mask is being stripped away. It certainly has revealed my foibles and faults as well in a glaring and delightfully humbling way.
One of the things that I've wrestled with is guilt. In a sense, I recognize how blessed I am. You know, I'm still on full salary. I have a good work-life balance. Don't have to travel as much, and actually feel very blessed by it all. And yet I'm serving a congregation that has people who have been ill with the virus and who have lost their jobs, or, you know, certainly it's on hold at the moment, and there's a lot of uncertainty around. And I guess I've had a sense of survivor's guilt within that. That's kind of how I've made sense of it in a way. And it's okay to be blessed. I've reached a point where that's the case, really. But it's what do I do with that to help others, I suppose. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Well, we have come to the, well, we're a bit over time actually. So thank you all very much for participating in this conversation. It has been a blessing to me, and I hope to many others. I will end the live feed. So say goodbye to all who are not in this conversation, but are watching, and thank you for joining us.